Okay, Basil. I mean, let's not sugarcoat anything. Donald Trump has singularly had one of the biggest influences on the courts writ large of any president. 234 federal judges appointed in the first term. There could be, as Sahil just pointed out, 5 members of the Supreme Court. What does this all mean?
Well, just to say, Joe Biden's not been a slouch either. There's like 220 or a little bit more judges that he's been able to appoint. But I think the concern is very, very real because, as you said, the judges of the Supreme Court now are going to shape the court for a generation. There's not just a couple of years, for a generation. So I understand the anxiety, particularly coming off of the RBG years and the concern around whether or not she should have retired. But Sonia Sotomayor is the first Latina to the court. She's still extraordinarily sharp, and it looks like, just as a non-legal person, the kind of questions that she asks and the ways in which she and the 2 other liberal justices have been able to talk and collaborate, Justice Kagan, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, have been able to sort of talk and collaborate. It sounds like they're still very strong and active and know exactly what they're doing. Some others will have to talk about whether or not she should retire. I'm not of that mindset, but I would say...
Does it show just how little control the left feels that it has?
Absolutely. It shows control. It shows how little control. It shows concern. It's a reminder that elections do matter. And I would also add that we need to actually start paying attention to the pipeline of judges, going all the way to local and state courts, because those are processes that most people do know nothing about, but are so important because they actually do provide the kind of pipeline that's important. So by the time, they get to these appointments, you can get the kind of ideology that you're looking for.
If Donald Trump, Julie, gets 5 members of the Supreme Court who he appointed, what does that mean in your view?
You could say goodbye to a lot of the rights you enjoy today. Potentially IVF is gone. Potentially marriage equality is gone. All sorts of environmental regulations are gone. Your water, your safety. I mean, all of this will be gone. It's already gone, by the way. I don't want to be a downer, but he's already got that majority. He doesn't need a swing justice anymore. He has his justices on the courts. I don't know who the Republicans are looking for to be more bold and fearless about not caring what the media has to say, but I think Alito and Clarence Thomas certainly fit that bill. They couldn't care less. They're doing whatever they ideologically want to do. So the nightmare is already here. And where I would slightly disagree with Basil is, yes, Sonia Sotomayor is incredibly accomplished. 70 is not old. She's deeply qualified and so on and so forth. But if we have the opportunity to put somebody on that bench who's 50 for another generation, which Sonia Sotomayor just statistically is not going to be there for another generation, just basic math, we should take that opportunity now, because God help us if something happens and Donald Trump gets 3 appointments to the Supreme Court.
What about that argument? I don't have to tell you this, Basil, there are a lot of folks who still, all these years later, are stung by the fact that someone who did so much for the left and who represented so much to women, as you rightly pointed out, Sonia Sotomayor, one of only 3 women who have been on the U.S. Supreme Court, then they feel she stayed too long, and it really, really, really cost them.
Oh, yes, I remember well, and I get it. I totally get it. My point is, there are legal minds that would be able to weigh in on on the work that she's doing and be able to talk about her ability to continue to do that for the next 4 years. I'm not that person, but I will say that the fact that we have somebody there that is Latina, that represents that community, but also has talked about and can represent the issues and ideology of at least half of this country, I'm not that quick to say that she should step down. That's my only thing. I don't want to be quick to do that.
Do you think they could pull it off? They'd have to have a lame duck session, right? And they'd have to push it through.
They'd have to do it, and I don't know if they can, but let's get real. I mean, for a second, there are other women, and I'm a woman, and I'd love to have another woman on the court. There are other women, there are other Latinas. This is not a knock on her. No more than it was a knock on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was an incredible jurist and an icon to a lot of women, including me. She should have gone a lot earlier than she did, because look what we were left with after she passed away, sadly. And so, I don't want to sit here and say, well, because we don't want to disrespect women or we don't want to disrespect Latinas. There is a deep bench of women and Latinas and anything else that you might want to consider who are in their 40s and 50s who could fill that seat. It does not need to continue to be filled by somebody who, because of basic math, may give Donald Trump yet another opportunity to fill that court seat.
Well, and I'll just look. I'm not agnostic about it, but I will say we got to think very seriously about that path forward. But I would also say that the Senate actually has a little time to start actually confirming judges right now. And that very small window is about to expire. And I think one of the things that Chuck Schumer is thinking about and is getting pressure to do is start to be able to promote judges today so that that bench could look a lot different by the time Donald Trump takes office.
Can we talk about the pipeline? Because I think, Democrats have been talking about this for a long time, whether it's getting more women and more people of color into Congress, into the Senate in particular, getting people in positions so they can consider running for president. It's tough, though, isn't it? I mean, let's talk about the average person who goes in to vote and what they know about the people who are on the ballot. Even state Supreme Court justices, what are the chances that they've done a deep dive? I just realistically, how do you elevate that to help people understand how important it is?
Well, look, we've got to learn to communicate with people better as a party, and I've been banging the drum on this for a long time. We don't do a very good job of it at the presidential level, never mind at the Supreme Court justice level or state Supreme Court or Superior Court justice level. What we need to do is meet people where they are. And we need to stop lecturing them constantly about what's at stake for you if you don't do the right thing, or there's a patriarchy out there and you have to fight against it, or so on and so forth. You need to explain to people in very real terms what it means for them today and why it's important for them today, not if it's important for them in a year or two, because people are having a hard time making ends meet. There are single mothers out there who don't know how they're going to put dinner on the table tonight. They don't have time to sit around thinking about Sonia Sotomayor's health or what's going to happen to the Supreme Court in a year or two if and when Justice Thomas and Justice Alito retire. So we need to change the entire dynamic of how we approach this issue with voters and how we speak to voters and how we make voters understand the urgency of now, as opposed to these very high-minded conversations that we have the luxury of having, but a lot of people don't have the luxury of having because their financial circumstances don't allow them that luxury.